Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Seeing Beyond and Through with Monty. Happy Sunday, the 3rd of May, 2020. Now, in front of you is an article that I have seen the past couple of days. It's gone viral, it's gone around the world, and it states that more than 80% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients in Georgia last month were black. CDC study finds. So the CDC has a need to really advertise that. Okay, a CDC study released Wednesday found that over 80% of COVID-19 patients hospitalized in Georgia last month were black. And the latest analysis showing that communities of color are being hit disproportionately hard by, COVID-19. But in actuality, I'm going to show you that communities of color, particularly black communities of color, are being hit hard by statistical sleight of hand. Basically, stats that are just trash. Stats are deliberately skewed to make it seem as if though blacks have this very high number. Stay with me. We're going to get to the meat of this. And they go on. A study from the CDC, which is headquarters in Atlanta, surveyed 8 hospitals in the state. Okay, they surveyed only 8 hospitals in the state. 7 in Atlanta. By the way, Atlanta is 52% black, one of the blackest cities in the United States of America. Metro area. Oh, and the metro area is going to be even more black, okay? And 1 in southern Georgia. And a sample of 305 COVID-19 patients who were hospitalized in March. 247 or 83.2% were black. Wait a minute. You surveyed only 8 hospitals in Georgia, and out of 305 COVID patients who were hospitalized in March, 247 were black. That's 83% of the survey, and yet you're not surprised that the majority in Atlanta who test positive for COVID-19 will be black? What kind of survey is that? What type of organization would even bother to do or release a study like that? Why not make the study straight across the board? Why not make a study 1,000 blacks, 1,000 whites, 1,000 Hispanics, 1,000 Asians, and go from there? Why do you have a need to oversample black people? Because you want the majority to be black. Let's go on. And here they go. More from the articles right there that went around the world. They went viral. More than 80% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients in Georgia were African American. Studies find. Okay, this study that only involved 305 patients, where 247 were black. They were 80% of the study group already. So this is big news right there. Okay. Surveying 8 Georgia hospitals. Researchers found that a sample of 305 COVID-19 patients, 247 were black, more than 80% and more than they expected. It is important to continue ongoing efforts to understand the reasons for this racial disparities, including the role of socioeconomic and occupational factors in transmissions. The researchers wrote, public health officials consider racial differences among patients affected by COVID-19 when planning prevention activities. Why aren't you guys considering people being oversampled? Why aren't you taking into the account of they're already disproportionately in higher numbers in the survey or sample numbers? Let's move on. Again, here goes more articles like that. They just went viral around the world. More than 80% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients in Georgia last month were black. CDC study finds. Let's move on. Now watch this again. The CDC is telling us how shitty their studies are. Because here it goes right here. Let's go down right here where it said conducted a survey. Adults who tested positive for coronavirus have been admitted in March. Now, among 305 hospitalized patients with COVID-19, the CDC, out of their own mouth, says 83% were black. Researchers were surprised by the statistics. Okay, what I'm more surprised is the fact that you only did such a low number. You only did such a low number of 305 hospitalized patients. And out of that low number, 247 were black. Why isn't anyone surprised by that? Why isn't anyone surprised that the premier health agency in America is even releasing a study like that? Why isn't there an uproar from black celebrities, black people about this study that is very skewed, that is making them be the face of COVID-19? Now go down here. For context, 7 of the 8 hospitals surveyed were in the Atlanta area. Atlanta, 52% of Atlanteans are black people. Okay, let's move on. Once again, far too many patients hospitalized with COVID-19 in Georgia are black. New CDC data shows a staggering 83%. Well, no shit. If blacks are 83% of the overall study group out of 305 patients, and they are 247, what do you expect? This is crazy. This is madness. Obviously, any agency who's putting forth these numbers have an agenda. Let's move on. 83% of people in Georgia hospitals with COVID-19 during March were black. People, the majority of that particular area are black. Why is that surprising? Released Wednesday, black people account for 32% of the state's overall population. Okay, that's the state's overall population. Okay, but what they're not telling you is that they are 52% of Atlanta residents. Okay, the finding reinforced other national data showing that black communities have been hit hardest by the virus in the U.S. First of all of these studies or surveys that they're talking about, data, all of them, blacks are overrepresented. All of them. They never do a data where you have like 1,000 blacks, 1,000 whites, 1,000 Hispanics, 1,000 Asians. They don't do that. They have a tendency to oversample black people. Like what they would do is that they would get you 1,000 black people. Then they would get you something like 600 whites. They would get you something like 400 Latinos, 200 Asians, and take it from there. Now you can see how the numbers are skewed to make blacks the face of COVID-19. And it goes on. Here's another report. A new report from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, released Wednesday, found that 83% of people hospitalized with COVID-19 during the month of March were black. Let me ask you this. When have they ever announced anything where the majority of a certain area were white? When have they ever put an emphasis on the majority of patients being white? It's like they go out of their way. Well, it's not like they do go out of their way to make sure that you know, or they want you to believe that these patients are black. And here it goes once again. They're telling us how inept they are. The CDC looked at demographic data from 305 coronavirus patients admitted to 8 hospitals. Remember that number, 8 hospitals, 7 in Atlanta and 1 in southern Georgia, and found out of 297 cases in which the race was known, 247 patients were black. So out of 305 patients, of 247 patients were black. You are surprised that the majority who would have COVID-19 are black? Anyone is really surprised by that? That makes no sense whatsoever. Once again, down at the bottom right here is very important. Black people account for 52% of the overall population in Atlanta and 32% in Georgia, meaning they were significantly overrepresented in COVID-19 hospitals. Wait a minute. If you are... No. The survey, 8 hospitals were done 7 were done in Atlanta, 1 in southern Georgia. So therefore, if blacks are 52% of the overall population in Atlanta, they would not be overrepresented in any hospitals in Atlanta. Come on, people. Once again, stories just continue on. Black people account for Georgia accounted for 83% of COVID-19 hospitalizations. Once again, from the foolish survey of 305 people, 247 were black. 83% of the participants were black. Let's move on. Another story. Here goes a graph right here. Black people in Georgia accounted for 83% of COVID-19 hospitalizations compared to just 32% of the state's population. No, this is from that survey. Once again, they're skewing numbers again. Well, they're skewing numbers. Blacks make up the majority of people in a racial group in Atlanta. They are the majority of 52% of the racial group in Atlanta. They are 32% of the state's population. A difference right there. Okay. Now, it admits here, the study doesn't account for every coronavirus patient in the state. Of course it doesn't. It's only involving 8 hospitals, 305 patients, and focuses primarily on Atlanta hospitals. They admitted it right there and focused primarily on Atlanta hospitals. Atlanta is 52% black, majority black. But the disparity it found, again, aligns with findings in California, New York, Illinois, Michigan, Kansas, and South Carolina. Well, actually, what they all have in common is that they oversample black people. And I'm in California. I live in California. And I can tell you the number of coronavirus patients in California are not black. I don't know why they added California there. In Michigan, it's the same thing, oversampled, basically. They came up with a number that it showed basically that they did not give it a fair numbering across the board among all races or ethnicities. Better yet, people, instead of doing that, instead of the CDC making this a race thing, why don't we just fight the virus? Why don't we just be Americans and fight the virus? Okay. The useless Surgeon General Jerome, whatever his name, Adams, states that we do not think that people of color are biologically or genetically disposed to get COVID-19. U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams said earlier this month, but they are socially predisposed to coronavirus exposure and have a higher incidence of the very diseases that put you at risk for severe complications from coronavirus. Well, that's not true, because 74% of Americans, the United States is a majority white. 74% of Americans tend to die from 10 known diseases. And the majority of those 10 known diseases, white people get them more. And as far as this goes to socioeconomic, that's not true neither. As I pointed out in the earlier video, I went through graphs. I showed you that the majority of the workforce in America are white because the majority of the people are white. The majority of blue-collar workers in America are white. The majority of workers in service industry jobs are white. The majority of poor people in America are white. And yes, the majority of rich people in America are white too. But America is a majority white country. They're giving you fake numbers all around. I just kind of read some of that right there. We're going to move on right there. Now, remember I told you that there was this study was done from 8 hospitals, just only 8 hospitals. But check this out. If you were to Google this, this is a list of hospitals in Georgia sorted by hospital names. According to the American Hospital Directory, there are 187 hospitals in Georgia in 2020. People, there were 187 hospitals in Georgia in 2020. The CDC chose to go to 8 hospitals, only 8, in a predominantly black area with predominantly black participants and release a statement that blacks are significantly, disproportionately affected by COVID-19. 187 hospitals in Georgia, and the CDC only conducts surveys from 8 of the blackest hospitals in Georgia. That says a lot about them. That says a lot about deliberate attempt. This was deliberate. This was no accident. When you're the CDC, you're the premier health agency in the United States of America. You have access to the best statisticians, stat people, mathematicians, doctors, surveys, all of that stuff right there. You could have taken your time and done this survey correctly. You could have taken your time to have gotten an equal number of majority white hospitals. Well, let me go back on that. You could have taken your time to have gotten an equal number of hospitals across the board. Black hospitals, white hospitals, Hispanic hospitals. I'm not sure how many Hispanics are in Georgia or the Atlanta. And you could have gotten the correct ratio of patients. You cannot go with making black people the majority of patients. Out of 305, make black people 247 of them, and then declare that, oh wow, we are surprised. The majority of the people that we tested are black. Let's do something about this. No, that's deliberate propaganda right there. Do a survey, a correct one, where you get the equal number of blacks, whites, Hispanic, Asians across the board. Do not overrepresentate black people. Now, this is on the Shade Room, and I noticed that from the CDC report right there, alarming CDC reports reveals 83% of Georgia's coronavirus patients are black. Out of this one article in which they posted, here's the damaging effects from that. Black people went after each other. They went after each other. This is the reason why I wish that black people or publications would not post this junk unless they read or do research to get the numbers behind it. But black people were blaming other blacks by saying, see, we're so hard-headed. This is the reason why we have so many COVID-19 deaths. This is the reason why we have so many COVID-19 patients. This is the reason why we catch it more than other people. We can't do anything right. We don't stay in. We don't follow orders. It went on and on and on. See what this does right there? Negative false surveys create this negative stigma. And it makes black people feel very uncomfortable with one another. Dislike one another. Distrust one another. Hate one another. Blame one another. It makes it very difficult to unify together and fight against a racist system, a racist society, where obviously that involves medical. It's permeated every segment of society, whether it be medicine, medical, as the CDC is proven right there. I showed you that with them, and I'll show you more too. I mean, every aspect of American society has racism in it. We're going to move on. Here goes again. New CDC from a different site shows how hard COVID-19 impacts African Americans in Georgia. Boy, they are pulling out all the stops. They are pulling out all the stops to make this a black disease. More right there, another post right there. You can read it for yourself right there. It's never ending. As I stated before, there's obviously a deliberate attempt to make COVID-19 a black disease, just like they did with AIDS and just like they did with herpes for black women, which I'll show you coming up. More than 80% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients in Georgia last month were black. CDC study finds. What study? What type of a study was that? Who would even accept that? What does that say about newspaper organizations or news outlets who would really take seriously a study of 305 patients of 247 were black? blacks were already overrepresented in that particular study. And it only involved only 8 hospitals in the blackest of areas. Once again, right there, bad news about COVID-19 and blacks continue. Kind of similar, very similar to the bad news about HIV and AIDS and blacks also. Why COVID-19 is hitting African Americans especially hard. See right then and there, what they've done right there, they've taken a small group of numbers and applied it to the overall black population nationally. So therefore, it's no longer confined to Georgia, but it's a national thing. The reason why it's hitting so hard is because blacks are oversampled. That's the reason why. It's a deliberate attempt to make COVID-19 a black disease. Georgia COVID-19 update. Deaths exceed 500. African Americans disproportionately affected. They are disproportionately surveyed. That's what it is. The disproportionately comes into how they are oversampled in surveys and studies. African Americans at higher risk from dying from COVID-19. We don't really know just the reason why, because every death is blamed on COVID-19. Strokes have gone down, cancers have gone down, deaths from pneumonia and flu have gone down, and COVID-19 deaths has risen up. Also, too, if they even suspect you of having COVID-19, they can list that down as the reason of death. So we don't really know this. Data shows that African Americans are dying from COVID-19 at a higher rate. Okay. African Americans struggle with disproportionate COVID-19 death toll. Once again, see that right there? Obviously, there's a deliberate attempt to make it a black disease. We're going to move on now right here. Now, I want to show you something right here. P. Diddy, he did a Revolt Summit. Why don't he talk about the disproportionate way that blacks are oversampled in studies? He did a Revolt Summit based upon the false numbers that were given out, where blacks were overly represented in these studies right there. And as I stated before in a previous video, you cannot build a movement upon a false structure or upon a lie. Basically, these celebrities like him, Magic Johnson spoke out about COVID-19 deaths affecting the black community. He did not speak out about the false studies right there that the CDC pretty much gave. They showed you right then and there. They admitted from their own mouth. 305 patients, 247 were black. The same thing happened in Michigan, Chicago, and black areas where blacks are overrepresented. Strange how they don't talk about that. Oprah Winfrey's another one. She gave a special, right, on COVID-19. Once again, building from a faulty foundation of lies. They don't say anything about how blacks are overrepresented. They don't question the CDC. They don't question numbers. They do not question anything. This is the reason why I keep saying, when these celebrities speak out about COVID-19, they do more harm than good. Beyonce spoke out about it. I guess the Surgeon General got her to speak out about COVID-19. Once again, spewing lies. It just seems like to me, as I stated before in a previous video, why don't they bother with their money to bother to hire statisticians, scientists, investigative journalists, investigative reporters who can get behind these numbers and then get back to them before they go online with these false speeches and lectures? Madonna, she has stated on her website that she's will align with Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci. Well, Bill Gates wants to eradicate the population by half, and he wants to mass force vaccinate every single person on the planet. Madonna, you're really for that? Okay, I want to show you something with the CDC's history. Let's go into their history because I've been studying them for the past 20 years. This is HIV among African Americans, which they're claiming that African Americans are the face of HIV and AIDS now. But what most people do not know, because it's not really talked about, what they did is the exact same thing they are doing with COVID-19. They go into predominantly black areas, make black people a disproportionate number of their study subjects and samples, and they take it from there. Look at this. Same thing. HIV hits black women hardest, CDC report says. Isn't this the same thing they're saying about COVID-19? Do you see a connection? It's almost like they have this will or need to make black people the face of every ill or disease in America. Read it for yourself again. While new HIV infections among black women have declined 21% from 2010, 2016, they still account for 6 in 10 new HIV infections among women in 2016. But what they are not telling you is that black women are oversampled. Black Americans HIV/AIDS, the basics. Key facts. I should say key lies, but let's go on. Black Americans have been disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS since the epidemic's beginning, and that disparity has deepened over time. That's a lie right there, because since the epidemic's beginning, actually, the first 20 years of the epidemic, it was primarily gay white men. It was never black women. It was always gay white men. So that's a lie right there. Let's move on. Read on. Although they represent only 12% of the U.S. population, blacks account for much larger share of HIV diagnosis. Isn't this is the exact same thing that they're saying about the coronavirus, COVID-19? 43% of people estimated to be living with HIV diseases. Listen to this. 43% of people estimated to be living with the HIV disease. 42% of deaths among people with HIV, 44 than any other racial group in America. So I guess what they're saying is that 44% of people is estimated. Well, these are estimates. What they did is that even if they suspect the HIV death, they can still assign that to you. Or what they do is that they do something called a presumptive diagnosis, meaning that if 30% of black women have AIDS, hypothetical number, let's go down farther. Let's say if 16% of black women are believed to have HIV/AIDS, by a presumptive diagnosis, they can bump that number up to 42%. And as I've shown back there with the celebrities, with newspapers, no one's going to question anything. No research will be done. No one will be held accountable. Let's move on. Blacks lead in the U.S. HIV/AIDS diagnosis. Okay, same thing that they're doing with COVID-19. The exact same thing. You see their motive. This is from the CDC. Okay, March 8th, 2007. Blacks continue to account for more than half of all new HIV/AIDS diagnoses in the United States, more than any other racial ethnic group. The CDC reports. The CDC reports. The CDC based its report on statistics coming from 33 states with confidential HIV testing programs. So first of all, it says from 33 states. Usually that's done over a period of time, and what they would do is that they tend to go to clinics, not private doctors or hospitals, clinics that are government funded. And who would be the people who would tend to go to government funded clinics? It would be poor people. Hold on, I know I said the majority of white people poor people in the U.S. are white. However, they are going to government funded clinics in black areas. Just like what they did the Atlanta, just like what they did with the 8 hospitals. These clinics that they tend to go to from these 33 states are in predominantly poor areas where blacks and Hispanics tend to live. Okay, look at this right here. Here it goes again. CDC again, the culprit again. CDC, genital herpes among black women high. See their agenda? See their agenda right there? Okay, Blacks with COVID-19 are, I guess, they're being hit hard by COVID-19. Um, Blacks, HIV and AIDS, number one group. Now CDC, genital herpes among black women high. Boy, they never stop. They never stop. They are definitely by making black people the face by default with faulty stats, negative numbers that are deliberately skewed right there, that only involves a small group of people with a large number of black participants. We can read it too. A new study from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention says black women have the highest rates of herpes infection at 48%. Nationally, only 16% of Americans between 14 to 49 are infected with genital herpes. Hilda Hutcherson, clinical professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the Columbia University, offers her insight. Let me explain about the study because I studied this particular study right there. At this particular study right there, first, black women who were 12% of the female population in the United States of America, they made them something like 60% of the study groups. That's how they got this particular number right there. The exact same thing that they're doing with COVID-19. They made white women at that time who were, I believe, this was 2010 when Barack Obama was in office. White women at that time were like 73% or 75% of the female population, but they brought them down, they reversed it. And what they did was that they made them something like 23% of the study group. Statistical sleight of hand from the CDC, once again, from 2010 to 2020. 10 years they haven't changed their game nor scheme, and they won't change it. Disturbing news this week from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The federal agency reported that 48% of black women between the ages of 14 and 49 have herpes simplex virus type 2 or HSV2. It's called. Overall, blacks and women were much more likely to be infected. The prevalence among all women was almost 21% compared to 11% for all men. Stop right there. Okay, you said that 48% of black women between the ages of 14 and 19. Okay, I've seen a study, and a study that I've seen, they only tested about, I believe, 300 women. It's 300 women. So these studies can range between like 600, 500, 400, 300 women. And what they normally do, what they always do, actually always do, is that they make black people, black women, black males, they make them the majority of the participants in these studies right there. They did not test 48% of anyone. Okay, here goes right here. CDC again. Nearly 50% of black women ages 14 to 49 have genital herpes. That's a lie right there. Oversampling black women is how they do it. Oversampling black people is how they do it. Those are lies right there. Okay, here goes. It just continues on right there. Almost one in every two African American women ages 14 to 49, the same old lie right there, has genital herpes. They did not survey or even test that many women. It's a lie right there. Report. Nearly half of all black women have herpes. See right there? Nearly half of all black women have herpes. So if black women are 12%, back then they were, I believe, 11% of the female population. That would have been about 40 million black people, around 20 million black women. 14 to 49 would have been, think about 9 million, 7, 8, 9 million. They did not test that many. They never test in the millions. They never test in the millions. They barely even test in the thousands. They don't even test in the thousands. So that's a lie right there. One of the studies that I've seen, the most that they ever tested was like 600. So therefore, from that 600, how are you getting half? How are you going from 600 into the millions right there? It's a deliberate attempt. Very much a deliberate attempt. HIV diagnosis. Now, we're going to move on because I want to show you something that's very important about this, about the CDC. The CDC. Now, this is the U.S. Public Health Service Syphilis Tuskegee study. Remember the infamous Tuskegee study from 1932 to 1972? Remember that? And then finally, in 1972, someone blew the whistle on them. They blew the whistle on a study. But in 1972, guess who was heading that particular study? Actually, guess who headed the study from 1969 to 1972? The CDC. And guess what? They defended that study. They wanted the study to go on. I'm going to show you that. Tuskegee study, 1932-1972, nearly 65 years after the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee began, President Clinton apologized. Okay. For the government's role in the study, it goes on to say, okay, at the bottom, it just says that in the wake of the U.S. Public Health Service, a syphilis study at Tuskegee and other studies, the federal government took a closer look at research involving human subjects and made changes to prevent moral breaches that occurred in Tuskegee from happening again. Tuskegee experiment, the infamous syphilis study, it was reported too that some of the men were injected with syphilis. Now, the CDC denies that. I kind of believe it's true. I do believe it's true. I've heard both that they claim they didn't. Others claim that they did inject some of them. Obviously, the ones who had syphilis, treatment was withheld, and they allowed their families to actually get syphilis. Okay, the Tuskegee experiment began in 1932 at a time when there was no known treatment for syphilis. After being recruited by the promise of free medical care, 600 men originally were enrolled in the project. The participants were primarily sharecroppers, and many had never before visited a doctor. Doctors from the U.S. Public Health Service. Back then, that was the CDC's name, by the way. Later became the CDC, which is running the study, informed the participants 339 men with latent syphilis and in a control group of 201 others who were free of the disease. They were being treated for bad blood, a term commonly used in that area at the time to refer to a variety of ailments. The men were monitored. This is another, yeah, okay. The men were monitored by health workers, but only given placebos, such as aspirin and mineral supplements, despite the fact that penicillin became the available recommended treatment for syphilis in 1947. PHS researchers convinced local physicians in Macon County not to treat the participants, and research was done at the Tuskegee Institute, now called Tuskegee University. The school was founded in 1881 by Booker T. Washington as its first teacher. Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Okay, this is a little bit about when they started. Formed 1946, 73 years ago. Done a lot of devilish deeds since then. A little bit about their history. You can read that. I won't get into it. Annual budget, $1.1 billion. Okay. Tells you what they supposedly are supposed to be fighting. Supposedly. I want to read this right here. I want to show you how diabolical they are and how diabolical medicine can be. And it's not this benevolent entity that people think it is. Let's go down to after 1947, penicillin became the available standard treatment for syphilis. Choices available to doctors involved in the study might have included treatment all syphilitic subjects, the closing the study, or splitting off a controlled group for testing with penicillin. Instead, the Tuskegee scientists continued to study without treating any participants. They withheld penicillin information about it from patients. It goes, in addition, scientists prevented participants from accessing syphilis treatment programs available to the other residents in the area. The study continued under the numerous public health service supervisions until 1972. The CDC took it over from 1969 to 1972. But the CDC's was a forerunner for these other agencies that exist right now. Because keep one thing in mind, they've been in existence for, what did they say, 70 years now? Okay, the victims of the study, all African American, included numerous men who had died of syphilis, 40 wives who contracted the disease, and 19 children born with congenital syphilis. So therefore, the CDC has terrorized the black community for decades, with the Tuskegee experiment, black women and genital herpes, black people and HIV and AIDS, and now COVID-19. Here goes your timeline. 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. 1972, Tuskegee study untreated syphilis in the Negro male was brought to public attention. Just giving you some things right there. Syphilis study begins. And watch this, people. I want to show you something. Remember when I told you the CDC defended the study and wanted it to continue? Look at 1969. 1969. CDC reaffirms need for study and gains local medical society support. The AMA, which is the American Medical Association, and the NMA, which is the National Medical Association chapters, officially support continuation of the study. The CDC wanted the study to continue until all men died, or how many more people could have gotten infected. They really didn't care. Right there, the CDC admits that they wanted this Tuskegee syphilis study to continue on. So therefore, it no longer surprises me of their antics, of them putting all the ills, the diseases, new or old, on black people. It doesn't surprise me at all with their statistical sleight of hand, with their falsification of numbers, oversampling black people, making the blacks the faces of COVID-19, HIV and AIDS, herpes, syphilis, any type of venereal disease that you can think of. Doesn't surprise me at all. After this little quick trip down memory lane in which I showed you, it shouldn't surprise you neither. This agency has never been for the benefit of black people. Never will be. So therefore, that gives you a little understanding about their motives and how they operate. And they do not operate in the best interest for black people. With that, that is another edition of Seen Beyond and Through with Monty. And I will see you beyond and through.